Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Here they come, and Indiana got to him. Sack.
Indiana football.
Oh, what a tremendous grab. Hoosiers are threatening at the 3-yard line.
Nothing beats game day in Bloomington, so get your Indiana football tickets now and be at family-friendly Memorial Stadium as the Hoosiers take on Rutgers for homecoming on October 12th. Adult tickets are as low as $30, and as always, youth tickets are just $10. Visit IUHoosiers.com for more information.
15, the 10, the 5, touchdown! How about that?
Rolling solo this week on Podcast on the Brink. Jerod couldn't be with us, but I do have a distinguished guest, actually a co-founder of Inside the Hall back in 2007, June of 2007. Eamonn Brennan, along with Ryan Carrazza, helped get Inside the Hall started. Eamonn then went on to a really successful career at ESPN.com and now is working for The Athletic based out of Washington, D.C. And we're happy to have Eamonn on this week to talk with us about not only Maryland, which is a team that he's going to focus a lot on this season, but also the Big Ten at large. Welcome to the show, Eamonn.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be back.
Always good to talk to you. And, we were talking a little bit before I hit record here about Maryland. And for me, they were, when I put together my preseason 1 through 14 of the Big Ten standings, they were one team that I could see finishing as high as second, and a team that I could also see, if things don't go right, finishing, I think middle of the pack, 5-6, wouldn't be a complete shock. What are your just general thoughts as Mark Turgeon gets this team ready to play? There's obviously high expectations. They're in the top 10 in several of the national polls, but what are your general expectations for Maryland and just kind of your feelings on what they can accomplish this season? Yeah,
I mean, I generally share the same view as most people, I think, in that they have the pieces to be really, really good. They obviously Anthony Cowan having a veteran point guard, back for his senior season after testing the NBA draft waters. Don't think he was ever really, likely to leave based on his likelihood of being drafted, but he's back and that's huge. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but we're recording this the same day as Big Ten Media Day. I think he was a preseason All Big Ten player.
Correct.
So that's big. And, they have the freshman class last year was really, really good and better, I think, than anyone expected. Eric Ayala was good from the jump. And they had, obviously they had Jalen Smith down low. And there's just a really nice blend, like positionally, with Daryl Morcell as a defender, Aaron Wiggins, Ricky Lindo is a freshman who showed up late last year, who's a really nice, gazelle kind of run up and down and grab rebounds and talking to people around Maryland in the offseason. They're really high on what he can do this coming year in terms of sort of how his game has developed from just being sort of a high energy rebound guy to putting a little polish on it. I mean, he showed up when he was basically 17 last year, pretty early, like late in the summer, but early for an incoming freshman, or late for an incoming freshman, early in his sort of life, basically. And people are really high on him. So it's a really good blend. They've got good guys coming in with the Mitchell brothers to help out down low, help replace a little bit of what Bruno Fernando did for them last season. And just personnel-wise, it's the kind of team that you look up and down the roster and you look at, the age of the players and the profile of the players and think there's no reason why this team shouldn't be really good. I have some reservations and we can get into those, but yeah, just on a basic sort of level, there's a good reason why the expectations are high. They should be a really good, top 10, top 15-ish team for most of the year, I would think.
One of the interesting things, and I'm not at Big Ten Media Day. We have somebody there covering it for us, but I did watch all the press conferences this morning. One of the interesting things that I thought Mark Turgeon said was they're not calling Jalen Smith sticks anymore. They're calling him logs because I guess he's put on some weight in the offseason. How do you see his role changing this year with Bruno Fernando gone, obviously off to the NBA? You mentioned some of the newer the newcomers that they have, the Mitchell brothers. I think most people expect at least one of those guys to make an impact. But how does Jalen Smith's role change now that Bruno Fernando's gone?
I mean, I think it's a lot more touches for sure. If you watched Maryland last year, you saw a lot of possessions where it was just a post up for Bruno, or was a pick and sort of a pick and roll or screen read play where he would catch the ball at the elbow or in the post, and it was kind of a clear out, a little bit more traditional offensive wise, and he was really good. I mean, he 62% effective field goal percentage. He didn't take many shots from the outside, which was good, but he was pretty dominant on the low block and a really good rebounder, got his own misses and the misses of others. Just a really effective, solid low post player. And Jalen Smith showed, I think, last season, the ability and the willingness to step outside a little bit more and space the floor, even at 6'10", even as a freshman. He shot 71 threes. He didn't make a ton of them. I think he made 19. But that's still a really, that's a promising sign when you've got a 6'10", 5-star recruit whose touches are going to be limited, whose usage rate is not going to be as high as it might otherwise have been if had Fernando not been there. I think this year, with more heft on him, we'll see more low post touches for Jalen Smith, but we'll also see him be able to step out a little bit more and space the floor. And I'll be interested to see if Maryland plays small. I think there's a lot of excitement talking to folks around the program about being a little bit more positionally flexible this year, using some of the guys they have like Wiggins and Lindo, who are athletes, to match up. Eric Ayala is 6'5", so even as a sort of a guard profile type of player, he's still got a lot of length on the wing and on the perimeter. And Cowan can really get up and down. So I will be interested to see if not only how much bigger Smith's role is, which I think it will be, and how many more touches he gets and what he's able to do with them after a year of development, but also how not having two guys who are 6'10", who are both so talented that you have to play them, will impact the way that Maryland's lineups look, because Mark Turgeon has traditionally used a lot of two big sets, but I think this team could be interesting with another ball handler on the floor a little bit more frequently.
One of the guys on this roster that is most intriguing to me, and every year when I go through the exercise of with Dylan Burkhart of UM Hoops, we put together a preseason list of the top 25 players in the Big Ten, and there's always a couple of guys that we want to put on there, but we say there's not enough evidence yet maybe to put that guy on there. And then at the end of the season, it comes back to haunt us that this was a guy who was a breakout candidate. And for Maryland, looking at the roster, to me, that guy is potentially Aaron Wiggins. What's maybe the next step for him in terms of his game and kind of how do you see his role changing now that, he's obviously a very good 3-point shooter, but can he kind of step up and be that third scorer behind Cowan and Jalen Smith?
Yeah, that's definitely the hope. I mean, I think the hope for him, he was a really good spot-up shooter last year. Again, he and Ayala as freshmen coming in, Ayala had a little bit more to his game, a little bit in terms of putting the ball on the floor, and was asked to do that more often than Wiggins was. But, Wiggins was basically a straight-up, spot-up 3-point shooter. Took a lot less or fewer twos than threes, and didn't shoot well at all from inside the arc. It's not often guys shoot significantly more poorly, from 2-point range than they do from 3-point range on the season, but he managed it. And I think he only shot like 20 free throws or 25 free throws, very low number of free throw attempts. So yeah, the hope for him is to be able to put the ball on the floor, to drive at closeouts, to not only play in the mid range, but really get to the rim. Because that Maryland already presents a lot of issues with those two guys, specifically Wiggins and Ayala, sort of playing off of Cowan, moving around on the perimeter, hovering sort of outside, where Jalen Smith occupies. There are a lot of issues trying to cover those guys. Particularly you see a lot of like sort of spread pick pick and roll sets. There'll be some motion offense, and then it'll basically boil down to almost kind of like a pro style pick and roll set. And you see the floor spread on either side with Wiggins and Ayala, and both of those guys can knock down threes. That's like NBA style basketball, right? It's like what the Warriors do. And if you can't get out to either of those guys, they're very hard to guard. And if you do, in Wiggins' case, he hasn't always been able to put the ball on the floor and drive that closeout. If he can, then yeah, it's another weapon in Maryland's arsenal. And even if he can, or if he's just okay at it, I still think he can have an even better season than he did last year, just from sheer volume and shot reps and being more comfortable in the offense. Like, it is difficult. Both he and Ayala came in looking pretty mature, with really good mechanics. Like, they weren't raw players. Like, they were really good right away, at least on the offensive end. And I think both of them will be asked to be even better defensively, but I think both of them have an opportunity to add. They may not revolutionize their games, but even if they get incrementally better, that's still a pretty big deal.
The other thing Turgeon talked a lot about today that kind of piqued my interest was just the ability that he feels like this team is going to be able to play in a variety of ways, not only be able to go small, but also at times maybe go with bigger lineups. The question for me is, with Bruno Fernando gone, who of the newcomers in the front court is ready to step in and make an impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mekhi Mitchell is the number one. He's he's sort of their top recruit this year. He's out of the district here in DC at Woodrow Wilson High School, and he's an important piece in that he seems, at least by all accounts, and I don't follow recruiting as closely as a lot of people, but by all accounts, pretty versatile, able to do a lot of different things, run, get out on the break, maybe not shoot the ball particularly well, but handle it and take care of it, and move really well. So I think, that and what apparently is a really good defensive profile is big for Maryland, because Fernando, it was easy to pay attention to his offensive game. He was really good on that end of the floor. He was a high production kind of guy, but his defense was really a big part of what kept Maryland afloat. Statistically, a lot of times when their offense was, and something we'll get to in a little bit, was turning the ball over a lot. His presence on the back line, his block rate, his length, ability to challenge shots and make it really hard. Once dribblers got to the second and third level, or preventing easy baskets against other big guys. I think Jalen Smith has a lot of that in his game, but he's not quite what Fernando was in terms of sheer strength and raw shot blocking. And so they'll need another interior defender, particularly for certain lineups against certain teams. And I think Mitchell will probably be the chief sort of provider of that.
What's the general feeling among the Maryland fan base, if you kind of have sensed anything on Mark Turgeon and how happy they are with him? Because I've been to a couple games there when IU's come there since joining the Big Ten, and just from being around campus, and I remember, I think the first time I came there, I just went to a sports bar before the game and was just kind of eating and talked to a couple fans, and it kind of seemed like there's mixed feelings on Turgeon. Not that people don't like him or think that he's a good coach, maybe more of a concern in terms of the ceiling of the program with him at the helm. What's your general sense on how happy Maryland fans are and just kind of people around the athletic program with Mark Turgeon? And is there any pressure on him to kind of live up to these preseason expectations this year?
Yeah, I think there definitely is. I mean, I don't know if there's actual pressure from, in terms of an administrative standpoint or a hot seat standpoint, but amongst the fan base, yeah, you definitely get the sense that people are getting a little disconsolate in some ways, because they're even last year, which was this sort of fun surprise season with a lot of young players, and having Bruno Fernando back, and they were 15 and 17 the year before, or some 17, one of the two. Not a great year. Coming back last year and being really, really sort of surprisingly good. They struggled a little bit down the stretch in the Big Ten, but nothing crazy. It's not like they fell apart. But I think there is sort of a a question over how high Turgeon can take them, and a belief, and a lot of fans have this belief about their program, but in Maryland fans' case, I think they have a point to a certain extent that the program, resources-wise and location-wise, should be a little bit better than it is on a yearly basis. Like, there should be, instead of getting to the NCAA tournament as a 5 seed, half of, one out of every 2 years or whatever, actually I think is about what his average is, that it should be competing to get to a Final Four every, feeling like you have a really good chance of getting to the Final Four every, 2 to 4 or 5 years. And they haven't felt that. I think part of that, the last time that Maryland had, I think, this high of expectations going into the season was the year, I can't remember it off the top of my head. It was maybe 2013-14.
I think it might have been the 15-16 season
when
Suleiman.
Trimble, Suleiman transferred. Trimble was in his sophomore year, coming back after an awesome freshman year, and they had Diamond Stone and Jake Lehman was still there. And I was at ESPN at the time, and I went to do a big profile on Maryland before the season because we had them number 1 in the country in our preseason poll, and I think someone else was in the AP, but they were number 2. So those expectations were really high, and I think they ended up as a 5 seed and didn't make it to the second weekend of the tournament, and that was a massive disappointment for people as that year went along. And there were internal issues with that team, and it's not necessarily entirely worth relitigating that entire history. But I think, I have a friend, a former coworker who's a Maryland fan, and I remember him saying at the time, we'll be a 5 or a 6 seed and we'll lose in the tournament again, and feeling really bad for him when that happened because there was such a sense of fatalism about it. That stuff goes away quickly if you're really good. If you're top 5 in December or January or even February, and there's real hope there and you're playing really good basketball, then that stuff I think will fade away pretty quickly. But I do think there is some consternation among the Maryland fans that they haven't been as good as they should be. And that this year, when you look at the talent there and the players that they have coming back and the chance for a lot of those players to get even better than they were last year, that, as I was just kind of scrolling through the comments on my State of the Program piece that I wrote on Maryland earlier this summer, sort of a big deep dive on them. And, a lot of the comments are, okay, Turgeon, time to win something now, along those lines. That's not literal, translation, but it's close. So, I think there's a lot of pressure there, at least from the fan base, and a bit of dissatisfaction. And now people are going to say, okay, there's no reason why we shouldn't be really good this year. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because I'm looking at their last 5 seasons, their win totals. It looks like they won 23, 19, 24, 27, and 28 games. Most places you take that. But I think it kind of speaks to, and I think Indiana fans in a lot of ways feel this way just kind of about the last 15, 20 years. It's not necessarily what you do in the regular season. It's what you do in the tournament. And if you're not making deep runs consistently, or at least every once out of, 2 or 3 years, then people are going to question kind of the direction. And that's, people who listen to this podcast frequently know that I'm a frequent critic of Mark Turgeon, just because I think they've had pretty good talent. But when I look at those win totals, I mean, that's a lot of games to win over the last 5 years. So I think they could obviously be doing a lot worse than they are. But I'm just curious to see this season how he responds to having the expectations, having 7 of his 8 top players back, and just those. I think the key to me is those 3 sophomores. Not named Jalen Smith, the other 3, Sorrell Smith Jr., Ayala, and Wiggins. I think how those 3 guys kind of come along is ultimately going to kind of write the story, because you know what you have with Cowan and you know what you have with Jalen Smith.
Yeah,
I think you feel pretty comfortable with some of the other guys, but if those 3 can really become much better players, I think the ceiling changes for this group pretty dramatically.
Yeah, and in mitigation, they were a really, really close heartbreaker of a game against a good LSU team last year from getting past the first weekend. And so then the narrative changes, right? Like a bucket in the other direction against LSU, and the whole not getting past the first weekend of the tournament thing goes away, and you're in the Sweet 16 and you see what happens from there. Or not getting deep enough into the tournament. It's a little bit different. I think maybe one of the reasons for dissatisfaction among fans, and I wrote about this during the season, and this brings me to, if you don't mind, my sort of reason to be cautious about overhyping Maryland, and that is turnovers. And it is, for whatever reason, I don't understand it, and I asked the players this summer when I was working on my State of the Hoops program piece, kind of about how you improve this. I've kind of been asking coaches just in general, because it's kind of a pet subject that I'm fascinated in. But for whatever reason, you look back at Mark Turgeon's teams over the last, really his entire tenure at Maryland, and their ball protection has not almost ever been good. Their turnover rate is usually somewhere between 18 and 20%, sometimes a little bit higher. And it's not a team that forces turnovers. Last year was a notable example because, Maryland was doing so much right on the offensive end, particularly early in the season, shooting wise, rebounding wise, and like hitting a lot of threes, shooting threes extremely accurately. When they got a shot up, the amount of points per possession they scored were extremely high, like even, relative to other teams. And that there were just so many wasted possessions. They turned it over almost, it was just shy of 20%, maybe 19, or just over 19% of the time. And so that was bad in and of itself, right? But then on the other end, they never forced turnovers. They were the fourth worst team in the country at forcing turnovers, which is fine if you don't try to do that. And you typically means you're not fouling that much. Like, you just are going to kind of sit back and let people shoot over you and rebound. And they did that. But the problem is, as John Gassaway, as I think probably a lot of listeners will be familiar with, he's done in the past few years what he calls shot volume, and he's tracked it. And it's basically like a very sort of, he has some math behind it, but the idea is, do you get more shots up than your opponent based on sort of your turnover rate, your offensive rebounding rate? Like, are you wasting a lot of your possessions relative to what your opponents? And when you look at Maryland, I think last year, midway through the year, I asked him for the numbers, and, out of the 75 teams he tracked, from major conferences, they were down in the 70s. And it was just like, there were so many possessions that they weren't utilizing properly, that they were allowing their opponents to do, that they were just shooting themselves in the foot, and so much marginal cost there that makes me a little bit nervous about this team. If this team does not handle the ball better, if this team turns it over at the same rate and doesn't force turnovers defensively at the same rate, then you almost kind of feel like their ceiling is limited in a way that that kind of feels like there's the next step you can take to be elite, to be like a number 1, number 2 seed. And if they can't stop turning the ball over, then the 3, 4, 5, 6 seed, or below, if in the worst case scenario, is what you're looking at. And then fans, I think, will look at that and say, this is another year where we turn the ball over too much and we waste too many opportunities. What's going on here? Why doesn't this ever improve? And I don't have a good answer for that. I don't think it's super simple. Whether it's stylistic or whatever, I don't know. But it is something to keep an eye on. And one reason, if you're going to short Maryland as a stock right now, that would be the primary reason to do it.
How much of that is on Cowan to not only there's two things I want to talk about with him, because going back to that preseason list of the top 25 Big Ten players, Dylan and I had Cowan at number 2, and your colleague Brendan Quinn, who I love his writing, I read everything he writes. He does a great job. They did a reaction podcast, and one of his biggest beefs with our list is that we had Anthony Cowan number 2, and his point was kind of, the turnovers are a problem. And the 3-point shooting last year took a big nosedive for him. How big are those two things for him going into the season in terms of not just his individual performance and whether he can be an all Big Ten player, but ultimately for what Maryland's able to do as a team? Because I feel like if he can shoot high 30s, low 40s, 3-point shooting and do a better job taking care of the ball, those would be two significant developments for Maryland. Is that do you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, those are the two things you would criticize about Anthony Cowan's season last year. I mean, he, to be fair to him, took on a really high usage rate and shot rate last year. Not like crazy, Jim or Fredette high or anything like that, but easily the highest on his team, particularly with shot percentage while he was on the floor. And he was asked to do a lot. He was asked to run the offense, but also be a primary scorer, be sort of the first option on the perimeter, and run things and make sure Bruno got his touches and make sure Jalen Smith was involved. And so he had a lot on his plate. But I do think it is fair to say that if he, shoots 34% from three on 200 threes again this year, then that's maybe not living up to probably his own expectations for what his shot number should look like. And yeah, the turnover is, his assist rate to his turnover rate, just as a raw comparison, percentage wise, is positive, right? Because his assist rate was high, it was 26.1%. That's really good. But again, yeah, his turnover rate was 19%. That is super high for a point guard of sort of his experience and skill, and just watching him play. Like, he is a really good ball handler. He is a smart player. He is quicker than almost everyone he plays against on the perimeter. There aren't many good reasons you would sort of, it's not like he's like, I don't know, like, this is a random example, but like when Harrison Barnes was sort of struggling as a freshman and his turnover rate was a little bit high, and you could kind of see why, because he was kind of trying to add like a perimeter game and a dribble game to his repertoire, and it wasn't quite there yet. Like, that's not the case for Anthony Cowan. I just think you're totally right. If his turnover rate goes down and his 3-point percentage goes up and everything else stays exactly the same, then his year will look vastly better, even though there's like I said earlier, it's on the margins. It's small stuff that adds up to a ton. And I also think, it's down to a lot of the other guys too. Daryl Morcell had, he's sort of has been used, I think, primarily as a defensive specialist. There's the hope that his game offensively is going to open up a little bit this year. And so he can be a little bit less of a plug and play option for matchups and such. But, that's a 6'5" guy playing on the perimeter whose turnover percentage was very nearly 20%. Ayala told me over the summer, he was asked to handle the ball a lot more often than he necessarily was super comfortable with. His was 21.3%. Bruno Fernando turned it over almost 24% of the time, which is a ton, and they won't have that. So it's a team-wide thing where the turnover rate was just too high. And then again, on the opposite end of the floor, if you're not going to force turnovers, that's fine. But a lot of the teams that do that, like the Virginias and Wisconsins of the world that play pack line defense and they don't stretch all the way out to half court and play man-to-man and risk getting touch fouls and sending people to the line, those teams don't turn the ball over like ever. So if you're going to do that defensively, you can't afford to turn it over on your end, because you're just shooting yourself in the foot. And Cohen, yeah, absolutely, everyone has to get better, but he's a major part of that.
I feel like we could talk about Maryland for a good hour and a half, 2 hours, but one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, besides talking about Maryland, is just to kind of have you help me make sense of the Big Ten this year, because there's three teams that I feel really good about. One of them we just talked about. The other two are Michigan State and Ohio State. Beyond that, I've got a lot of questions about a lot of teams. I feel pretty good about Purdue, because they have, I feel like, a pretty good, strong returning nucleus, and I trust Matt Painter is going to figure it out. After that, I don't necessarily feel great about any other Big Ten team. I know there's been a lot written, said, predicted about Illinois, but I was there in early March last year when Indiana's season was on life support and they blew Illinois out in their own building, and it's mostly the same players coming back. And unless Brad Underwood is going to change some things defensively, I just have question marks on how that's all going to work. Michigan has a brand new coach, Juwan Howard. We don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know if, one of the things I worry about there is Xavier Simpson and John Teskey. Are they system guys that worked under John Beilein, or are they really good college basketball players that can be good in any coach? Iowa, Jordan Bohannon, is he going to play? Is he not going to play? I mean, kind of Wisconsin, they lost Ethan Happ. I mean, these are this kind of just, to me, the whole middle of the league is filled with question marks. Of those teams that I mentioned, who do you feel the strongest about being, an NCAA tournament team for sure?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, probably Purdue. Do we count them in that group?
Yeah. I mean, they lost Carson Edwards, who's one of the 2 or 3 best players in the country last year.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, I think Purdue is probably my bet because, again, like you said, they have good sort of experienced returning players, but also Matt Painter is kind of to that point now that coaches get to and programs get to where, they may not be taking Virginia to overtime in the Elite Eight good every year, but they're going to be good every year. Like you can kind of set your watch to it in the same way as like Bo Ryan era Wisconsin. Like there will be fluctuations here and there between how good they are, but by and large, you can expect them to be in the tournament and be pretty good from there on out. I mean, there are going to be good teams in this league. I'm pretty sure of it beyond Michigan State and Maryland, but and Ohio State. I think I agree with you. I feel pretty good about them. I think Holtman is an awesome coach and is has talent coming in, but is also kind of now in that phase where he's building his own thing, and it feels like it has his fingerprints on it a little bit more stylistically and culturally, and I think that all bodes well for Ohio State. But yeah, the rest of the league, I mean, I did a mailbag over the summer and someone asked me to pick the projected finish of the Big Ten. And it was just like, I was doing it and I think I wrote, it's just like after the top handful, where do you even go with some of this? Because Michigan, you would, in theory, put them up there with, having a guy like Simpson back is just massive. But I know nothing about how Juwan Howard is going to coach at the college level, like nothing. And
are we sure Juwan Howard knows how he's going to coach? That's a question for me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I don't say that as an insult, like
me either. Because he's never been a head coach.
Exactly. And I would say for Michigan fans, if any of them are listening to this, one local example that I would maybe draw an analogy to is Pat Ewing, who had never been a head coach either. Had been an assistant coach of various, of repute at the NBA level for 15 years, and just for whatever reason couldn't get an NBA team to give him a head coaching job in the way that a lot of those guys who are noteworthy assistants for a long time tend to get those jobs. So he took the Georgetown job when it came open, and he's done a really good job so far. So there's a chance that could be the way for Michigan as well. But we don't know yet. You just don't know. And, I think part of the uncertainty is the fact that I think basically, Illinois is another great example. Like, I think I'm kind of on the Illinois hype train. I think Brad Underwood, like I still remember, hearing the news that he was leaving Oklahoma State and going to Illinois. And I was sitting with John Gasway, who now is getting his second shout out of the podcast. But I was sitting next to him and he, is an Illinois fan, and he was over the moon, just like, wait, this is going to be our coach now? Because he had done such a good job at Oklahoma State. I think he'll get Illinois there. This might be the year. Maybe they close in a little bit and they're like a fringe tournament team, and then they're not like maybe quite as good as everyone is on the high end of the hype train with right now. But I think they'll be good. But Wisconsin will be decent. Iowa will be decent. Penn State will be decent. Indiana, I don't know, better than I would. Probably okay, not great. Minnesota, okay, not great. I think Rutgers will be okay, not great. Like it's Nebraska maybe, and then like Northwestern is the only team that you can look at in the league and say, I think that team's going to be bad. So the uncertainty not only comes from trying to figure out which of the teams in the are going to finish behind Michigan State and maybe Maryland, but in trying to figure out like what's 3 or 4 through 10 or 11 in the league going to look like. I think it's going to be a massive jumble, and that may be the case even deep into the actual conference season when everybody's just kind of beating up on each other and things aren't all that much more clear, because I think everybody's going to be decent but not great, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for me, Illinois is one of the more interesting teams. I'm just kind of curious. You seem to be more on the positive side than the negative side with them. Do you think they're going to change anything defensively? Because to me, that's the biggest question mark. If they don't, I don't know how much different they're going to look on that end of the court. And stylistically, is that something, do you think Brad Underwood would even be open to trying to do some different things? Because to me, it just seemed like last year, if they would have stayed in front of the ball more often instead of going for a steal on every possession, just from doing that, they would have been a lot better defensively. I just didn't understand kind of what they were trying to do. It never worked, and it seemed like he never deviated from that. Do you think there's a lesson that he'll learn from that and maybe change some things up?
I mean, maybe, but I also think, in his second year with a team that no one's expecting to be that good, that when you're trying to build towards something a little bit longer term and more sustainable, that you just plow ahead. You know what I mean? Like, I think last year for them, they were in the phase with their program where it's like, no, we're just going to keep doing this and try and get good at it, because if we switch it up midway through the season, what are we really accomplishing? Like, are we going to get to the tournament? Nah. Like, are we going to play in the NIT? Probably not. So let's not quit what we've spent the last year and a half trying to do, even if it seems, mildly insane at times, because, you build that system and that style, and it's worked for him basically everywhere in the past. His Stephen F. Austin teams were incredible at pressing and playing up-tempo basketball, particularly in forcing opponents to go really fast. And his Oklahoma State team was that same way as well. So to me, it feels like they were in that stage of a program build where, like Georgetown again is another good example. Last year, they were in the phase where they're just going to play fast. Like, Ewing wants to play fast. He wants to get out on the break, and they couldn't guard anybody. And at various times, it might have been smart to slow it down and, take up the clock, get a good shot, and get everybody back on defense. But Ewing's like, no, we're going to play fast. We're going to play secondary break. This is the kind of way I want to play. We're not there yet, but, we're going to throw our freshmen into it. And eventually the style will be sort of filled out by better players, more mature players, developed players, and everybody will be on the same page. So I feel like it seems unlikely that there will be changes in that regard. Maybe so, but this is kind of the way his teams have always played. And when you're building from basically scratch, at an Illinois program that hasn't had success, I think you have time to get blown out by Indiana or Purdue, because you're trying to press and it's not working and you're not forcing turnovers, because it'll pay dividends down the line, at least theoretically.
I can't let you go without asking you for some thoughts on Indiana. I really don't even know what to ask, because I have no idea what to expect out of the season. I'm asked every day, is Indiana going to be better? Are they going to be worse than last year? I can come up with reasons on both sides of the ledger. I'm still kind of trying to process the fact that they lost 12 of 13 games at one stretch last season and beat Michigan State twice. That's, to me, one of the weirdest things that happened in all college basketball last year. It's like they beat Michigan State twice, but they lose 12 of 13. I can't comprehend what. I mean, I guess I'll start here. I think when he was hired, the offseason he was hired, Chris Holtman came into the league, Archie Miller, and Brad Underwood. And I think Indiana fans at that time felt pretty good about the hire. Do you think they should still feel good about this hire? Do you have reservations on the direction of the program under Archie Miller? And is there anything that you've seen from him in his first 2 years that kind of leads you to believe that he may not work out?
That's
a loaded question, Eamonn.
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I think, here's how I feel about it. I would say that I would still think that Archie Miller is a good hire. Like, he was at Dayton for a long time. His teams were really good, and or generally were good and probably better than most Dayton teams should be. And you kind of look at what Dayton was a little bit before his tenure and what they've been since, and you can kind of see, like, Dayton is a great basketball town and people love that team, but it's not a self-sustaining program in the way that some are. So, and I think he's still in his second year, or just finished his second year. It's still early. I think expectations got ramped up really quickly because of Langford, and obviously because of the way Juwan Morgan developed as a junior and senior. And the Langford thing, didn't really work out the way I think everyone expected it to. He had an okay year, struggled in certain ways, was good in other ways, and then went to the NBA. And so you're kind of back at, like you said, on the floor this year, I have no idea what to make of Indiana, no idea what to expect. I get asked that as well every now and then. I don't know. What I will say is, while I still think Archie has a chance to be a really good coach for Indiana for a long time, that I do understand coming off the year that Indiana just had and having friends, obviously, who went to Indiana and, text during games and so on and so forth, that I can also understand the frustration and the doubts already creeping in, right? Like, I still hold the opinion that it'll probably be fine, but I can totally get why people would be looking around going, hold on, this isn't the trajectory we were expecting. And yeah, I mean, I think the way that last season went, if you had finished, if Indiana had finished, 19-16, I think that probably would have been regarded as a disappointment in general, or say 17-14 in the regular season. That would have been a disappointment, but I think the way that it went, the way that it happened, was so strange and so Jekyll and Hyde that you can't help but wonder, if you can win those 4 games they won at the end of the season, beat Wisconsin and beat Michigan State in back-to-back games, and then win your next 2 and get, within probably a loss to Ohio State of getting to the NCAA tournament. Like, what was happening for the last month and a half when every game was a loss except away at Michigan State? I totally get why those questions would be asked and why it is just really hard to get your arms around this Indiana team and this Indiana program right now. I think wait and see is probably the best way to go, because I have no clue how good they're going to be. It doesn't feel like the kind of year that you can say ahead of time, okay, this team's going to be better. Here's X, Y, and Z. I also don't know that they'll be worse. I'm just, after last season and having to deal with them on the bubble watch constantly and losing every single game and yet somehow still being on the bubble, I'm completely yielding to the universe on Indiana right now, and we'll see. But I would say, in conclusion, I think Archie will be fine. Generally, I'm still at that point, but I totally get why, if there's a camp of people who already think not, I can't say I think those people are totally crazy either, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I haven't formed a strong opinion on it one way or the other, and obviously I'm at most games. I watch every game closely because that's obviously my job. But one of the weird things that you have right now in the fan base is you have one faction who says they look at Chris Holtmann taking over at Ohio State, going to the tournament his first 2 years. They look at Chris Mack taking over at Louisville. He got into the tournament last year, and now they're a preseason top 10 team. And then you have other people citing Tony Bennett's first couple of years at Virginia and Coach K's first couple of years at Duke, and saying, well, not every coach that takes over a program hits the ground running from day one. How much of the adjustment from what Crean was in terms of his style of play going to Archie, which to me is totally different, how much do you think that plays a part into just kind of taking time to turn over the program and kind of get it, quite frankly, a different type of player? I mean, if they don't get Romeo last year, and they had to take him, don't get me wrong, but if they don't get him last year, I think the conversations are a lot different, because the expectations maybe got inflated to the point where they were unrealistic. And then when things went bad, everyone said, well, this isn't going to work out. But if you take a kind of a longer look at it, is there a case to be made that, it's really just going to take him time to get his system kind of fully in place and get the right guys in there to execute what he wants to get done?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think that's totally right. If Langford doesn't go to IU last season, and if their losses are dispersed a little bit more evenly throughout the year, as opposed to in this just massive chunk in the middle of the season, then you're looking at your sort of bog standard second year of a rebuilding project. And, your best player is a guy who's a senior who predates you, who's, and you're kind of building gradually around him with younger guys and so on and so forth. And at that point, the reaction is probably, oh yeah, that's the second season. That's what you do. That's kind of how it works when you're and you're looking for different things, right? When you're an Indiana fan in the second season, you don't have Langford on campus, and or your team isn't beating Michigan State and losing 12-13 in the middle of the year, then you're sort of like looking for players who could develop, and you're checking for a style of play, and you're a lot more forgiving about the actual wins and losses. And so, I think that seems completely accurate to me, and like a really good insight is that if circumstances were slightly different last year and the season ended up the exact same way, then the conversation probably wouldn't be happening yet. And I do think I think the Tony Bennett thing is spending a decent amount of my time as I do now covering Virginia. The Tony Bennett thing is a fair one, because you look at what he's built now, and it's remarkable. It really is remarkable. But the way he wanted to build it and what he always wanted to do with it was never going to be conducive to, the second year we're going to be really good all of a sudden, and then we're just going to be good from now on. Or, quick fix type of big recruit, get in there. The sort of the Calipari going to Kentucky, and all of a sudden Kentucky has John Wall and DeMarcus Cut. Like, Tony Bennett wanted to build in his own sort of image a program of guys who would be there, for 3 to 4 years, unless, except in rare circumstances, guys who fit their mentality, guys that they could develop. And it takes a little while if that's the kind of thing you're trying to build. And I think most people would at Indiana would want, the Virginia sort of ethos implanted onto their program, not to mention the way they win. You can't just do it in a year or two, and you can't expect to be able to assess it in a year or two. You have to give it a little bit longer. And, if year 3, year 4, year 5, it's not there, then fine. You go in a different direction. That's the business. But it is probably still a little bit too early. Like I said, I because of the way the season played out last year, I get it. But, things could have been a little bit different here or there. A win or two and in the opposite direction, maybe you go to the NCAA tournament, and then everybody's like, hey, we're in the NCAA tournament in the second year of Archie's tenure. Look how good this is. So it's a wait and see for me.
Last question, and we'll get you out of here, Eamonn. I'm looking at the national landscape this year, and I know you're going to be doing a lot of national coverage this year for The Athletic. And for anyone who isn't subscribed to The Athletic, I definitely recommend at least giving them a shot. There's just so many. I mentioned Brendan Quinn earlier in the podcast. He does a great job. There's just so many different guys around the country covering various programs that are doing excellent work. So definitely check them out. But from a national perspective, Michigan State's kind of the popular pick to be the number one team. And maybe my view of Michigan State isn't as high as everybody else because I saw them lose to Indiana twice last year. But does Michigan State being number one in the preseason tell us that it's going to be a strong year in college basketball in terms of power at the top, or is it more of a year of parity where we may have 7 or 8, 9, 10 teams that ultimately that are going to have a chance to win it all when the tournament tips off?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think. You look at last season and, these things come in cycles a little bit, but like Michigan State, knowing Michigan State, you almost like they'll be statistically probably a top 10 team all year, but they're going to lose a couple games. They almost always do. And they may do so early. And so they won't be number one forever. I don't think it's that kind of a year. Or that kind of a team. And you look at last year, I mean, because of the way Virginia's previous season ended to UMBC, everyone kind of like, they weren't really in that same discussion, but you look at what they had returning, and the fact that DeAndre Hunter was going to be so much better. And it was just like, okay, strip out the NCAA tournament, like the way the season ends, and this is going to be a juggernaut type of team. And they were, and then Duke was obviously just a powerhouse, particularly early in the year, just like a terrifying team. And Gonzaga went toe to toe with them. And, like Texas Tech really kind of like they were good all year in that same way. Carolina was up last year and really solid. So it was a good year up at the top last year. And I feel like Duke and Virginia, at least for me early on, kind of established themselves as like, okay, this is going to be a slugfest in the ACC. And the games between them were both really good, and Duke won both of them. And Zion made Virginia's defense look silly, which never happens. So I don't think it's that kind of a year this year at all. I think beyond, you sort of look at the preseason polls and you go down the list of teams that you feel really super strongly about. And I've seen people having, we spent a bunch of time talking about Maryland as a good example. I've seen people with Maryland in the top 5. And if I'm not even saying that's wrong, if people have Maryland in the top 5 or a team like Florida in the top 5, then that should tell you a little bit about what you need to know with all the reservations we had about Maryland, that things are going to be a little bit wide open this year.
Read his work at The Athletic. He's also on Twitter at Eamonn Brennan. It's always good to catch up with you, Eamonn. Always enjoy reading your work, and thanks for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Happy to do it, man. Good to catch up with you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.